welcome to the Emotional Web podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human condition. And I love the diversity of guests that we get on this podcast. Partly, and it's quite selfish, in that I get to talk to some really incredible and interesting and different people. And it shows like the massive diversity that the role that emotion has, or the role that emotion plays in the workplace. Now, today's topic is sort of, well, I guess there's a term that's kind of kicks around HR a lot, which is employee engagement, and it's always kind of made me shudder. It's always kind of given me that kind of ooh thing down your spine. Partly because it means so many different things to so many different people, but also it often just gets reduced down to like a survey and an action plan that invariably never happens or never gets done anyway. And then I guess more recently I've noticed that there's a new term entering the lexicon that kind of replaces, or maybe for some people sits alongside, employee engagement, and that term is employee experience. So as happened before with episode, I think it was 11, where I wanted to get someone on to talk about clean language, because I saw the term clean language and thought, that sounds like a load of rubbish. But rather than me make a biased assumption as to what it means, I would get someone on the air that knows a lot more about it than me. So that's what I wanted to do with employee experience, really. So just because I'm seeing this phrase entering the kind of language patterns that I see in conferences or around HR folk, actually, you know what, I'd like to get someone on who knows a lot more about that topic than me. So our guest today is Lara Claxton. Now, Lara is a practitioner and, if I may be so bold as to say, an early days researcher, particularly into employee experience. So before we kind of carry on and get into more, let's get on the air. So I'd like to welcome to this podcast our guest Lara Claxton. Hello, Lara.
Hi, Phil. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And how are you doing today?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you.
Good. So thank you for joining us, and we'll find out a little bit more about what you do and why you do it shortly. But before we get into that, I have my standard opening to this podcast, which is an unexpected but innocuous question. So if it's all right, I'll ask you that next. Is that okay?
Of course.
Fab. So my question for you then is, what has got away from you recently?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. What has got away from me? I think probably time always gets away from me.
Okay.
And I'm forever chasing it. So yeah, I think being able to be as efficient as I can do and try and make the best use of my time is something that I'm always chasing.
And are there any particular examples of recently where either you managed to kind of not let it get away from you quite so much, or where actually it's really got away from you?
Yeah, I mean, I think even this week has been a really busy week, and I think it's just about really trying to take the time within a busy period to really just have the space to think about priorities and what needs to get done, and juggling all of that, and not just inside of work, but life in general. But I think sometimes just taking that time to breathe and reflect is important during busy times. Our Yeah,
I couldn't agree with you more. So the thing that's got away from me recently is money.
Right.
So for our listeners, I completely forgot that I was recording this podcast this morning. Lara rang me about half an hour ago and said, "Are we recording today?" And I was like, "Yes, we are." And I'd completely forgotten. And the reason for that is because at about 5:30 last night, I got a succession of texts from my bank to say, "Have you made this transaction? Have you made this transaction? Have you made this transaction?" And that's kind of just hijacked all of my attention really since then. So yes, I've managed to achieve other things, but my mind keeps wandering back to, how did they get my card? How did that happen? Because I like to think I'm quite sensible and stuff when it comes to online security, and yet that seems to have happened. So that's kind of hijacked a lot of my attention over the last 12 hours or so. So apologies again, Lara, and I feel like I want to do it like on the air, an on the air apology for the fact that I completely forgot that we were recording the podcast this morning. So
well, thank you, but yeah, it sounds like you've definitely had a lot of stressful things on your mind, so not a problem at all.
So thinking about what you said around time then, and I guess maybe this is a bit of a tenuous link, but I'm not sure actually. In terms of the employee experience, I guess time is something that must get away from a lot of organisations and the employees that work within them as well. And does that affect the employee experience, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think, that's the interesting thing about employee experience is it encompasses everything really. And, trying to understand all of the aspects that impact that experience is really important. And, being able to measure that so that we can make informed decisions when we're designing it, because essentially employee experience comes down to the emotional connection that individuals have with an organization and how you interact with each other, and so time is a key factor in that.
And how did you, where did your interest or your fascination with employee experience come from?
So I think in essence it's always been there, although I probably didn't really understand what employee experience was. So from a kind of practical perspective, the way I'd always approached HR was really trying to kind of immerse myself in the culture and really kind of understand, how people interact with each other, how that informs their emotional responses and how they behave. And that's kind of what really interests me in an HR context, and how we can make the best use of it for our employees and our organisation. And I think combined with that, I also got involved about 3 years ago in implementing a big HR system. So we had a big kind of technological changes. So that also kind of led me more into the technology world and trying to understand that in the organisational context, and again, how we make best use of technology. And so it kind of got me more involved in understanding user experience, which is really where employee experience is derived from. And I suppose what fascinates me is that, from a non-technical background, I'd always sort of seen IT as a bit more separate to that kind of human experience. And I couldn't have been more wrong, because actually technology and the human experience are kind of one and the same, and actually kind of getting the best user experience is really about having a human-centered approach. And so I think HR and IT, as we go into the future, will become more and more intertwined, and working very collaboratively to achieve really the same end goals.
So that so there's a number of things then in my head. So in a minute we'll I think we might benefit from taking a step back and trying to define some of the stuff that we just talked about. So trying to define what is user experience then, and how does employee experience link in with that, or how do those two things link together? But that last thing you mentioned in particular really got me thinking. If I was to ask like 100 HR people, which function in the business do you think HR either needs to or will be working more collaboratively with in the future? I don't think many would say IT.
No, and I think that's a really interesting thing, because when I speak with our CIO, he very much sees HR as the key department, as we go forward to work with. And I think, we need more of that, the kind of senior HR and IT professionals within organisations understanding how much their roles impact each other. But I think in general, that's something that I find within organisations anyway is, perhaps a kind of a misunderstanding as to how important working collaboratively will be as we go forward in the future. Quite often you'll have everyone sitting in their little kind of silo departments, coming up with ideas and solutions for their areas, but without really kind of considering the impact of what that could, the impact for the other departments. And I think that's kind of, in some way how our approach to HR at FDM developed probably kind of 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
In working kind of quite differently, in that we really kind of took a step back to understand, how we could create core value for the business from an HR perspective, and without really knowing what systems thinking was about. What we were actually doing was kind of taking a systems thinking approach, which is to look at the organisation as a whole system, and really try and understand all the kind of components that make up that system and how they all interrelate with each other and impact each other. And I think the more we kind of just see departments in isolation in terms of what they do, the more challenges and barriers we create for a company. And a lot of my work was going around to other departments saying, well, have you spoken to this department? Because actually what you're going to implement could impact their area. And it's really important we create kind of workshops where we're kind of collaboratively working together to really understand how we get the best results. And so what we actually plan to do at FDM, because of who we are as an organisation, so just to kind of explain.
Yeah, go on. Yeah.
So we take on graduates, but also we have an ex-forces and a returners program. We recruit over 1,000 candidates per year, bring them into our offices and train them in our academies in various kind of IT disciplines for around about kind of 14 to 16 weeks. And then we deploy them out to our clients to go and work as consultants for our clients, delivering sort of digital services for them. And so what's interesting for me is that about kind of 85-90% of our workforce isn't in our offices. They're out with our clients, immersed in our client environments, and kind of working remotely to us. So as an HR function, we are a people organisation, and what was really important to me was, rather than, you'd inferred it earlier, going down the route of looking at initiatives around employee engagement that perhaps can seem a little abstract to the C-suite sometimes when HR are kind of coming up with these things, was actually look at commercially, what do we do as a business and how can HR add value? And what we did was to really align ourselves with our sales function, who are working with our clients on a day-to-day basis, who are ensuring that our consultants' well-being is doing well out on site, ensuring that they've got the skills and the knowledge that they need to deliver for the clients, and seeing how that piece works. And so really now, the way that we work is our HR team are out on site, our client environments, understanding that kind of culture and environment and the challenges that they face on site, and being a support for those consultants so that we can deliver the best service for our customers. And in doing that, it's allowed us to take a real kind of systems thinking approach, in that we understand a lot more of all the nuances around the business, and how that functions. And we're very much core in delivering the best that we can to not just our employees that are out on site, but also our customers. And I think, again, that kind of comes back to some of the core thinking from even sort of the Harvard Business Review. They put together a service profit chain, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but
no.
That very much has at its core kind of employee satisfaction and sort of employee retention and productivity, and how that then equates through to the sort of external service value and onto the customer satisfaction, and obviously the revenue growth and profitability of the company. So very much this service profit chain sees the employees as a core component, which impacts the customer and then obviously impacts the organisation's growth overall. And I think that's where kind of HR become critical within that. And so I think that was kind of an interesting component for us to come back to your question in terms of what departments we have to work with collaboratively.
Yeah.
And for me as an HR function, it was all of them. I think very much certainly understanding the business functions and how we can help them, and not necessarily with add-on initiatives, but actually kind of core functionality through our kind of people insight and knowledge. And, again, with that, I think IT is also critical within that, because digital informs that employee and customer experience and how we interact with them, and how we, innovate and remain competitive in today's market. So, if people and technology are the core of who we are as, for our future businesses, then IT and HR are critical within that.
Yeah, so there's so much in that I want to go back and revisit. So the first thing I'm going to do, though, is to say to anybody listening, I want you to challenge or agree with me, please. So I made a very blasé generalisation that I thought if I asked 100 HR people, not many would say that the function we're going to collaborate most with is IT. So on Twitter or wherever you kind of get your podcast from, please feel free to leave comments or mention myself or Lara. Lara, what's your Twitter handle?
It's @Lara_HR.
Okay, so either at Phil Wilcox or @_Lara_HR. Tell me if I'm talking absolute rubbish. Tell me if I'm spouting a load of call bullshit on me if you need to, and tell me if I'm making it up.
I think in this day and age, from what I see, there's an awful lot more collaboration between HR and IT going on within companies, which is fantastic to see. So we're certainly not an isolated case. There's an awful lot of it going on, and actually more predominantly in the public sector as well. There's a lot of kind of IT thinking and the way they approach things, infiltrating the way people approach HR. So I'm sure there will be some Twitter people coming to you on that.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds good. All right. So we've had a few different terms that we've kind of talked through so far. So we've had employee experience, we've had user experience, also sometimes known as UX. We've also had systems thinking as well, and you sort of defined systems thinking for us as you were working your way through that. The idea or the notion that you don't look at something in isolation; you have to look at it how it sits in and how it interfaces in with everything else that happens and everything else that goes on. And that kind of links in with a lot of the work I do around how I go on all the time about how context is everything, that you can't look at something in isolation, you have to look at it in context with what's happening, what else is happening elsewhere, what else has happened in the past and what could happen in the future, and then that gives you an idea of where you can go to analyse something. But can we take a pause to kind of define either, because you said that the employee experience kind of comes or has come as a result of user experience, so would it be useful to come up with a working definition of what we mean by user experience or UX?
Yeah, so I think user experience is really a look at how you emotionally connect with the user to enhance their satisfaction of a product or a service. I think traditionally it comes from kind of the technology world, and so user experience experts would, for example, look at a website, see where users were clicking on a website, understand that journey through the website and how they make it the most accessible, the easiest to use, the most engaging, so that people want to go there. Okay. And it incorporates an awful lot of stuff. It's not just a kind of technology approach. It's psychology. It's it's about that kind of human experience. So it integrates an awful lot of aspects into it. But I think what's core to user experience, which I think is sometimes a missing link, is that design process. And design, obviously, design theory goes back a lot of years before technology was really core to kind of what we do.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's the user experience design theory is what is really critical to employee experience, and understanding how to make it as effective as you can. And so I think, that's what's really kind of core, is that design process that you go through, and then understanding kind of the emotional connection that you can gain and the behaviours that derive from that to get the outcome that an organisation would hope for.
So could you give me an example of that from either your experience or from a HR point of view then? So how would that design theory / systems thinking approach, how have you or would you or do you apply that to an aspect of your work?
So I suppose if we go to kind of design thinking, because certainly it's something that a lot of organisations are starting to incorporate in terms of the way that they approach how they implement something. So really that's kind of looking at how you define what the problems are initially. You look at kind of the challenges that you might have. You then co-create, get a lot of people in a room with lots of post-its, maybe have a hackathon, and really kind of come up with ideas which could be from the crazy to the more practical, to really kind of brainstorm and try and create a lot of ideas around kind of the problems that you might be looking at. Then it's kind of defining that further and deploying that, but then testing it. And I think this is a core part of what experience is about, is that it's not about spending a lot of time designing something and then coming up with something in the end that then stays there, doesn't get measured necessarily, and perhaps a few years later gets re-looked at. The whole point of the experience process is that it's continual change, so you don't just kind of sit still on it. And so it is about implementing something, then measuring it, seeing what the impact of it is, and then being able to go back in and iterate and re-plug some changes into it to try and tweak it and define it a bit better. So the whole designing thinking process is a continuum. It's not a linear process. And so I think, for me, what's interesting about experience in general is certainly it's about changing the way you do things and the way that you think. I think a lot of people kind of look at employee experience and think, right, we've got to go out and buy lots of fancy technology because that's how you create a great experience.
Yeah.
And that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to start looking and thinking at it differently. And part of that, you probably heard some of the sort of exercises that people go through, which comes from kind of user experience, which is looking at personas. So coming up with the type of employees that you might have within an organisation to understand that persona, looking at the journeys that they go through and the touch points. So, really experience is interested in the interactions that you have with individuals and understanding those interactions or those touch points and understanding which ones are more meaningful in terms of changing that emotional connection and behaviour, so that we can understand them better. And they're the elements that we might focus on as a problem that you then create further ideas from and tweak that element within the journey to then measure and see how that changes an individual's overall behaviour. So I think, when you think of experience, it's about looking at the whole thing, but it's also about kind of breaking it down and understanding how each interaction impacts the next one, and how that kind of flows through. So I think, a useful exercise to begin with is to kind of map out that journey, map out the kind of core interactions that you have with your employees, and you need to think about it from before someone even applies for your company, because already you're creating an emotional connection with an individual before they've even decided to apply for the job. And I suppose that comes into a bit of that employer branding concept.
Yeah.
And then right through to the end as well. The end for me of employee experience isn't when someone resigns or leaves the company. It's way beyond that, because I think, maintaining that emotional connection with people that have worked for you is really important, so that they're continuing to advocate the company, hopefully recommending people to come work for you. And I think if you look at companies out there that do great experiences, you can see kind of the difference that it makes. So I suppose in the customer experience side of things, Apple's a big one that out there in terms of how they get users to emotionally connect, or customers to emotionally connect with their products, through fantastic design, but also that kind of, it is very much an emotional connection often that customers have with Apple. If you go into an Apple store, it's a different customer experience to a lot of other stores that you go to, and a lot of people just go in there to hang out because they enjoy being in that environment.
Yeah.
And that breeds a different kind of emotional connection, which is a loyalty that you don't see necessarily with other brands. I suppose on the employee experience side, although it is a bit of a classic one, but certainly Google and certainly in the earlier days was one that, we all know what the employee experience is like at Google, because everyone talks about it, from the kind of fun environment to, I know they've implemented some changes recently, but from when they first started out, 20% of their time used to be focused on learning about things that just interest themselves, not necessarily related to the role. So, there was a lot of aspects in their day-to-day employee experience that was very much focused on the employee and making that experience the best it could be for them. And I think probably above all else, when I look at employees that used to work for Google, they're always the ones on Twitter or LinkedIn that always put ex-Google employee on their profile.
Yeah.
Always something they're proud of. It's always something that they promote, and that has really helped Google be able to get some of the best talent because, you know, they're continual advocates. So I think the power of experience is really critical. I think I've gone way off from your question.
No, it's fine. It's okay. It's useful and interesting. So if I think about then, so you mentioned earlier on that the FDM recruit IT graduates, go into an academy for a period of time, then they go off to a client site where they're consulting for IT projects or of some description. Is that right so far? Yeah. Okay. So I guess then if I look at a segment of that employee experience, so and this is something you alluded to earlier on. So I'm a graduate. I've completed my 14 to 16 weeks. I then go to a client or a customer site, and I've got two cultures that I have to kind of consider. So one is the FDM one, and where I've come from, and the interactions that I have with you as my employer. But also I need to fit in. I need to fit in the office, in the teams, in the function, in the business unit that I've now been placed in. So my experience with you as my employer might be amazing, but my experience with the team or the client might be awful. Likewise, my experience with the team or the client might be amazing, but actually my experience with you guys isn't great at all. But both of which could cause me to look around for other jobs, to leave, to bitch and moan about you, to do all those sorts of things. So how do you track that? How do you monitor that then?
So I think, it's a really valid point, and it's definitely a challenge, I think, for any organisation where your employees aren't necessarily kind of working at a desk in your office and you can have a direct impact on them. There's a lot more kind of indirect aspects to their experience that might be harder to control, but I think it doesn't mean that we can't understand them as best as we can. And I think there's probably a couple of important things that come out of kind of what you talk about. One of them is the kind of cultural aspect. And I think, one of the things that got me into HR in the first place was when I was younger, doing a lot of traveling. I had a real interest in anthropology and kind of immersing myself in kind of other cultures and trying to understand them from their perspective. And I think for HR practitioners, that's a really important approach to take, because I think, we often talk about culture in quite an odd way, I think, sometimes within HR, in that...
In an odd way?
Just in terms of, we feel that we can make cultural change quite easily, I think, in some ways, the way that it's discussed. And I think, it's very challenging. Culture is such an ingrained part of who people are, and I think you can nudge elements of it, but I think it takes a long time to actually change culture. And I think, if you're working for a company, automatically you become immersed in that culture, but it's really important to still try and take a kind of outsider's view of that culture, because I think there's obviously all the cultural norms and things that when you're within that culture, they resonate with you, they mean something to you in a different way to an outsider. But to have a big impact to the way that you act as an individual, the way that you feel, the way that you behave. And so understanding all of those cultural nuances is really important. And so for us, where we're potentially dealing with two cultures, and how that's impacting an individual, it's really important for me that we kind of have that outside-in approach of really trying to understand it, because I think that has a big impact to their experience. And obviously we're less in control of a client's culture and what that looks like. But what we can do is understand it and understand how it impacts individuals, so that we can manage things appropriately, or prepare people, or just kind of understand at least kind of why they might say or feel how they do. I think in terms of kind of, being able to manage that, it just really is kind of about asking people as much as you can do, and really understanding. I think it comes back again to that kind of experience design process of looking at the important touch points within someone's career. So understanding that emotional journey that individuals go through. And I think you can track that. You can kind of assess it and understand where the important aspects are. So, for example, at FDM, we don't do annual employee engagement surveys, as a lot of companies don't anymore. And engagement for me, a little like yourself, is a bit hard sometimes to understand. And interestingly, I went on the Engage for Success website the other day, and they've slightly amended what engagement means. And I think what's interesting for me is, if you talk about user engagement in the context of user experience, it's not trying to define what behaviours that you're looking for. It just talks about trying to improve the interaction, to improve the satisfaction for individuals. But that could be different for every single experience. And I think trying to define engagement as one size fits all is not necessarily appropriate. But I think when we look at kind of that whole journey and understanding it for our employees that are out on a client site, for me, what's interesting is trying to define those important moments within their employee experience or their career journey, and understand those data points that we want to get an understanding of how they're feeling and how they're behaving, because we know that they're critical moments when perhaps their behaviours might change. They're slightly longer away from our office environment, so perhaps the connection becomes less strong, so it's an important moment to kind of check in and understand how they're doing. And I think that's kind of what's important with experience, is that we've done away with the annual surveys for a lot of people, but what they are doing is implementing pulse surveys, which could be monthly, could be quarterly. Again, they're looking at a moment in time when they're measuring how people are feeling and how they're behaving, rather than actually looking at a moment in a journey, which I think is far more critical if we want to understand how people feel and how they behave, is, really focusing on those important moments. And so for us, for example, we'll look at when they've been out with our clients for a kind of 3-month period and a month period, and we'll look at the kind of critical times. And because we've got so many employees going out on a day-to-day basis, we have data coming in then every day, because as people hit 6 months out with our clients, we've got their data coming in from that point. And so what we can actually track is, at 6 months into their employee experience out on site, this is how people are feeling and behaving, rather than saying, on the last day of the month, this is how everyone feels, which they're all at different points in their experience and their journey on the last day of the month or the last day of the quarter. And so I think we just need to start thinking differently, because if we want to try and assess data, we need to make sure it's the most useful data to get an understanding from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so those critical points that you mentioned then, for you or for FDM in particular, they're chronological points then for you, are they? So I think I heard 1 month, 3 months, 6 months?
Yeah, so we'll take kind of chronological moments within their employee journey as they go through their time with us, because we know from experience that they're kind of critical times when we can influence how they're feeling and how they're behaving, as opposed to just random points.
Okay. And are there any other critical moments then? So you mentioned, the if you can be clear about, or what those critical moments in someone's career are, then you can use those. You can use that knowledge then to establish how people are feeling, or the extent to which they feel emotionally connected at those points. So you've got the chronological ones. Have you got any other ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I think if we just think of it more generally rather than in sort of the FDM context, anything where there's kind of sort of decision-making moments that could potentially be career-changing are really important. So whether it's any kind of performance management process, whether it's any decisions around progression opportunities, obviously certainly around the kind of initial stages of recruitment, selection, onboarding. They're really critical moments to kind of understand. So, throughout that whole employee experience, there's going to be numerous kind of elements and components that are going to be really important for you to try and understand as much as you can do. And I think that's where it comes back to that design thinking process, because if you can assess the data at those points and try and understand it, then you can then go back, look at the problems from when you were assessing that data, and go back into that design thinking process to come up with different ideas, and try and then measure how those changes impact that experience. But I think the whole time what you're trying to look for and understand is that kind of emotional connection and how it drives the kind of behaviours that you want as an organisation.
And how do you measure that then at the moment, Lara? Is that...
So yeah, we don't have any kind of fancy AI tools that kind of robots make around on a day-to-day basis. And I think,
you're not using like facial recognition, hacking into people's webcams and seeing how many times a day they smile or anything like that then?
Unfortunately not, no. I think, obviously surveys are a tool that people use, but I recognise that there's elements within surveys that aren't necessarily always helpful, but they do allow us to understand some aspects of the experience and the journey.
Yeah.
Through technology, it's quite helpful because you can assess things like how often people log into systems, what kind of activities they're doing in those systems, and that gives you a real indication of, how people might be feeling and behaving, whether they're constantly in their emails and, working all hours, or whether they're kind of not working at all.
Yeah, okay.
I think there's ways through technology that you don't have to ask people how they're feeling and behaving, but you can actually see that for yourselves through the digital tools. So they do allow us to understand a bit more around kind of what people are doing, to try and kind of understand people a bit better. Yeah. But I think for me what's important is, like I say, we don't have loads of kind of fancy tools, and there's certainly some elements around implementing AI that I think you really do need to understand what information you are getting, what are the limitations of that technology, because however great it might look, technology is always going to have limitations, and you have to account for that when you are trying to assess the data and understand it. I think there's also a huge element of ethics around that as well, which I think will be big for companies as we go forward, where people are putting Fitbits on employees and monitoring kind of where they're going kind of throughout the day. And I think, that has the potential to create a bit of a disconnect between the organisation and the employees, and elements around trust. I think trust is a big kind of part of that emotional connection, which if organisations don't get right and don't build that trust, then they're not going to be able to deliver great employee experiences. You've only got to look at the Endelman Trust Barometer, the report this year. Again, employees are seen as much more trustworthy than CEOs and the board of directors and stuff, which they were last year. So there's definitely a kind of bit of a disconnect, I think, between organisations and the employees, and I think being able to put employees in charge of their experiences is also kind of really key.
Yeah, because I guess one of the challenges with looking at things like system access or system utilization or time online or time on whatever is that gives you a really clear idea as to what the behavior is. It doesn't necessarily tell you what the emotion or the feeling or the connection is that sits behind that. You can see what somebody's doing, but you can't necessarily see kind of how they feel. So I'm guessing then there would be a need to support that with other data sources to say, okay, well, I can't conclude that because Phil is on his emails every day and he's spending however long, or Phil's on this system and he's doing these things every day. That doesn't necessarily preclude that he is engaged or he's having a great experience. It could just be that he's got a manager watching over him every minute of every day, and if he's not being closely monitored, he gets in trouble. So therefore, he's omnipresent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think 100% agree with you. I think it's something that people do quite often. I see, around data, is they'll kind of, see a result come through from the data and it seems to fit what they hoped it would, and then they're quick to kind of make an assumption and say, yes, this is the result. And I think it's not entirely accurate, and you have to kind of take everything into consideration. So, for example, we do a lot of correlation analysis around kind of our consultants out on site with our clients and the interactions with our clients to understand, how that relationship manifests itself and how it interacts, so we can kind of better understand it and hopefully deliver a better service for both our employees and our clients. But, I understand as well with correlation that, it could just be a coincidence that you see patterns within that data. And so, a big part of what we do is to actually take the insight that we get from the data analysis that we're able to do at the moment, and take that around the business to then get people to interrogate that data and put their own observations to that data to kind of really try and make a more informed decision, because it's I suppose it comes back a bit to that kind of cultural aspect. Someone within a culture will see things differently to someone who's outside of that culture, and if you're looking at the data, someone in one department will view it very differently to someone in a different department. And so having that insight from all around the business on the data analysis that you have, without trying to kind of make assumptions from it is really critical. In an ideal world, I would love to have a huge function where we can do kind of causation analysis and do a lot better kind of analysis, so that we're in a better scenario to be able to kind of understand things from the data. But obviously, as with any company, you do what you can with what you have. But interestingly, I think it's important as well when you're looking at research, is to understand the quality of the assumptions that they're putting out there as well. So I see an awful lot around how employee engagement equals customer satisfaction. So the more engaged your employees are, the better satisfied they are. It's always relates back to correlation, which always fascinates me, because there's no definitive answer to say with anything that correlates to each other that they're causing the other one to happen. And I think, especially given the fact that none of us can really define engagement in a helpful way. I'm not quite sure even what they mean. But interestingly, there was a great study by Moira Clarke, who works at Henley Business School in customer management, and she, with some fellow colleagues, had done a project where they'd done some analysis over 10 years, and we're looking at causation rather than correlation, so it's a lot more interesting to me. And the results that were coming back on that was around the fact that employee engagement, as they'd viewed it, they found causation between employee engagement and how it impacts retention and well-being, but actually nothing to do with the customer experience or organisational performance as a whole. And actually what they did find caused a change or an impact in a positive way to the customer experience and organisational performance was much more around kind of your frontline staff, those that are dealing with the customers, and actually allowing them to be a bit more empowered, rewarded and recognised for what they do, but being able to make decisions in the moment for that kind of customer, being able to have great team cohesion and a structure within that team so that they feel that they can do the job that they need to do. They're not kind of tied up to lots of other things, and just where they're able to exude that kind of warmth and support and customer care element. And I think that comes back to that emotional connection for the customers to those employees within the organisation, which I think for me as well reaffirms why the way that we work at FDM, having HR really involved in our kind of frontline employees of our sales staff, as well as our consultants out on site that are working directly with our our clients is the really critical area for us to be looking at, because that's what really is going to drive a change to organisational performance. And if we can understand how those interactions happen, then hopefully we can make both better employee and customer experiences.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, and I'm saying a lot of, because I guess I'm going to put a couple of challenges in with it as well. So I think sometimes correlation is all we've got, so sometimes that's the best we can get. So ideally, would we love to do some causation analysis? Absolutely. But we haven't got the infrastructure, or we haven't got the method. So when I say the infrastructure, we haven't got the opportunity to say, right, I'm going to work hard to isolate other variables from this equation to establish the extent to which X causes Y. So we're starting with a hypothesis that if we have more engaged, or we have a better employee experience, that will equate to better customer experience, which will equate to improved organisational performance. If that's the case, then we need to work out what are all of the variables that can affect customer experience, what are all of the variables that can then affect organisational performance, and try and isolate out all those other different aspects to monitor and track all those different other aspects, so that we can justifiably link or put a causation between X plus Y equals Z. And I think in the world of work, that's really hard to do. Because the skill set to be able to do that is really rare. I think the opportunity within an organisation for the board of directors or whoever that would be to say, yes, let's do that. Let's put all of that effort and energy into doing all of those things to actually find out if that's the case or not is rare. So when I say the infrastructure, I guess I mean because what that needs is a very particular view and mindset into, right, we really need to interrogate this data, and to a certain degree that might mean that we pay less attention to other things for the short term, because we want to build this rich picture of data in the long term. But that can be a really tough decision to sell or make, and then the skill set that sits behind it can be really tricky. So I agree. Ideally, you'd want causation studies, but if you can get decent effect sizes and so on, or impact results, then great. But sometimes the correlational bits are all we have to go with. So if I then think back to something you mentioned earlier on, which I think, if I've understood it correctly, is that yes, we may review what our employees are telling us, or what the data that our employees submit to us is saying about their experience at a client site, but we may also ask the client what their experience is of our employee that's there. So as well as asking the employee, how's it going for you, we can ask the customer or the client, well, how is it going for you, to then see if we can establish some patterns between the two. So if the FDM employee is saying, it's amazing, it's brilliant, it's the best place I've ever worked, I can't believe I'm so lucky to be here, thank you so much, and the client's going, yeah, they're all right, yeah, they're okay, they're doing enough, they're doing all right, because you got potentially a mismatch of data there, which you then go and interrogate and investigate some more.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of what you said. I think it's very true. When I'm talking about certain aspects, I suppose it's kind of ideals that are nice to kind of work towards. I think, certainly when we're talking about humans in an organizational context, there are so many elements that can impact it that, organizations just don't have the resources to be able to understand it, in every kind of context and understand how it impacts each other. But I think kind of having that kind of systems thinking approach and just applying it to the data is really important, so that I think it's the assumptions that we make sometimes that we need to be more careful with. So even if it is correlation data that we're looking at, or even if it is even more basic than that, to just understand, okay, what parts of data don't we have, and what other things could be influencing it, and could it be that customer satisfaction is what's driving employee engagement and not the other way around, and just actually really questioning all the data. And I think sometimes we're quick to jump to something that might suit us rather than kind of questioning it all. But certainly, yeah, for us at FDM, it's really important for us to understand both sides, both the employee and the customer experiences, and how that kind of relates to each other, because then we can hopefully understand both sides of it better, but deliver better for them as well. I think if we just look at things in isolation, potentially we have a danger of making assumptions that might not be accurate. And we can only do what we can do. Every organisation is going to be restricted by the resources that they have. But I think as long as organisations are taking the time to try and understand things and try and make improvements, and try and kind of understand things in a bigger picture rather than just kind of jumping on a solution because they think it'll work. And I think kind of taking a step back and seeing things now that they are kind of on a change continuum. It is a kind of cyclical process. It's not a linear process. It is something that we need to kind of keep measuring and understanding what evidence we have to kind of back up what problems we actually face as an organisation, and then try and kind of create new ideas around that. But yeah, we're limited in terms of what we can do. I think my approach to it is just to question everything, which is probably really annoying.
No, never annoying. Always good. So and I think in terms of the I think I hear them called lots of different things. So sometimes I hear them called like moments of truth, which is certainly very much a P&G. Or I've heard from a lot of people that have worked at P&G type approach, where they say, right, well, what are the moments of truth for who insert blank? What are the moments of truth for an employee? What are the moments of truth for a customer? What are the moments of truth for whoever? And then designing things that sit around that. So, and that for me I'm then linking that in with what you talked about earlier, which is the idea of those crucial points in somebody's journey. Whether they be, from a HR point of view, you might say, right, the moments of truth are application, offer, annual, or whether it be an annual appraisal or whatever the approach to performance management is, that those performance management interactions could be life milestones. So how do we deal with different life milestones that people have, whether that be becoming a carer of an infant or elderly, whether that be geographically moving for a job. So what are those really important moments in somebody's career? So, and you can gather that data. You can even gather that data context specific to your organisation. You could run some focus groups, run some go and investigate what are the moments in somebody's career that they say to you matter the most. What are the moments that have mattered to you the most when you've been here working at this organisation, and then you can use that to inform when you find out how people are feeling. Because actually, if people's if the responses are these five times are the most important things for me. So when I've got a problem at home, that's a really important career decision for me, because when an organisation doesn't support me when I've got stuff going on at home, then I think, I can't be bothered, I'm going to leave. Or when you've been immensely supportive, you've engendered my loyalty for a decade to follow. So if you can define what those moments are, and then if you gear up your investigation into how people are feeling around those moments, as opposed to like you said, it's the last working day of the month. It's the 15th of June, which is when we do our annual employee survey every year. If you gear up your data collection to those moments that matter, as opposed to an arbitrary date that you choose, then the data that you're going to collect is going to be much more helpful and beneficial for you as an organisation to think about your employee experience than just some arbitrary data that you get at some different times of the year.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think a couple of elements with that. I think I have seen some parts of employee experience going down the route of employee engagement, where they're trying to kind of sum up a percentage or a point scoring system and create a numerical value to the experience, as we did with the employee engagement. And I think, most people, if you ask them, yeah, okay, we managed to increase employee engagement from 80% to 85% or whatever, I think most people would agree that it's fairly abstract and no one really understands what that means.
Yeah.
I can see that we're tending to do the same with employee experience as well. There's a few agencies out there that are starting to put organisations in a kind of ratings war on employee experience, and what percentage or how many out of 10 are you on some employee experience rating scale. And I think there's a real danger in that, because I think exactly what you've said, it comes back to those moments of truth, which is a sort of marketing term applied to customers, but I think very much works in that whole kind of approach when you're looking at experience, and applies to the employee as well. And I think, that's something for HR professionals to consider is, what are the lessons that we need to learn from employee engagement? Because employee experience is not just the new term for employee engagement. It's also not just a rebrand of the way HR does stuff, but actually it comes from a whole range of other disciplines where we need to kind of learn and understand what they've already learned and understood, so that we can apply it to our kind of HR context when we're looking at employee experience. And obviously that goes back to design theory and into kind of user experience design and the way kind of IT and technology approaches things, but then also marketing. So customer experience was the first area to kind of come out of the technology world, as it were, into defining something slightly different. Obviously the technology world is interested in humans in an organizational context and through technology, so they will always see that it encompasses everything, but certainly marketing defined it for kind of that specifically with customers, and I think moments of truth is a really useful way to kind of look at things and apply into the employee experience. I think one element that I would say is obviously marketing have really, there's a lot of studies out there around customer experience and what organizations have done to really kind of develop their brand and kind of build that emotional connection from their customers to the brand, and how that helps. And I think I do see a lot of marketing language infiltrating HR, which I think is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time, because I think the customer experience is different to the employee experience, and whilst there's elements of it that definitely resonate and it's useful for us to learn from that, certainly around people kind of looking at the personalization of experiences and how you can try and not just kind of create one size fits all for all your employees, because everyone's going to want a different kind of experience depending on who they are as an individual. And so having those choices to be able to define your experience is really important if you're able to do that. Also not kind of defining experiences based on kind of stereotypes, so the whole kind of millennial thing, not all millennials are the same, strangely enough, and some people that aren't millennials.
Stop the press, shock horror story, not all millennials are the same.
Headline. So that personalization thing is really important and stuff. I suppose something that doesn't quite resonate with me as much is where kind of the whole concept of treating employees as consumers feels a little bit strange to me, I suppose, when we're looking at experiences, because I think that's kind of something that's different. So whilst obviously in customer experience, it can be a bit more transactional, although I appreciate that their end goal is customer retention and creating customer loyalty and people loyal to those brands. I do think as employees we have a different expectation than as a consumer, and I think it could be a danger if we start kind of bringing everything over from customer experience into employee experience. And I think we need to think slightly differently, because I think it is a longer, it's a different kind of relationship. Employees have a lot more involvement with an organisation as an employee than a customer does.
Yeah.
Usually.
Well, yeah, but also the contract is completely different. So
exactly.
as a consumer, I am buying a product from you. Yeah. As an employee, I'm being paid a salary to do work. I'm not buying you. As an employer, I don't buy my employees as a commodity.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I think I completely agree. It's that I suppose, that psychological contract as a consumer or customer compared to an employee, and it's my expectations as an employee are totally different to my expectations as a customer, and so I think there is a danger if we start going down that road of trying to apply consumer behaviour. There's an awful lot of research and study out there about consumer behaviour, but if we map that straight across to employees, we're not doing our employees justice, I don't think, because my expectation as an employee is entirely different, and I think we need to be coming up with our own concepts around what employee expectation is and how we create the best emotional connection with our employees, which is derived through who you are as a brand, kind of what you stand for, what your values are, what your culture is and what that impact is, because all of those elements have a real impact to the engagement of an individual. And I don't mean engagement as defined behaviours, I just mean how they interact with the organisation.
Yeah. And I want to ask a question that actually, so it's a question that I don't want to ask because I don't like it, but it's a question that I can imagine are in a lot of my listeners' heads, which is, so if what we're trying to establish is that emotional connection, how do you or are you measuring or quantifying that emotional connection?
I think there's different ways that you can do it. Certainly from my own kind of personal experience, like I say, we don't have kind of advanced technology. There's certainly a lot out there that kind of will look at. So if you look at user experience, a lot of organisations will use, like you say, kind of facial recognition to kind of look at people's expressions, eye monitoring. They'll sort of assess your kind of heart rate, your temperature, all those kind of things to actually assess people's emotional responses. Well, most organisations aren't going to have the ability to do that. And so, often, sometimes it comes down to kind of, the standard survey, although taking into consideration, kind of the limitations of that. But I think also there's some exciting things out there. So, for example, in recruitment, part of our selection process, we work with a company called Arctic Shores that implement gamification as part of kind of psychometric testing.
Okay.
And so through that, you're able to assess people's emotional responses and behaviours as to how they're using the games within that kind of process. So it is testing knowledge, but some of it's kind of skills-based. Some of it will look at their propensity for risk, for example, through those games. So it will really be able to understand a lot more of the psychology of that individual through the way that they're playing a game. And gamification, you do see that coming into play a lot more. And I think, it's a fun way of doing things, but it's also another way of assessing emotion and behaviour without asking someone to kind of cognitively respond in something that's given to them by the organisation. So already they're probably thinking about how I need to respond.
Yeah.
It's a fast-paced way of just kind of being able to kind of take a check on people and get a bit more insight into them. And so, there's a whole host of tools out there and ways of kind of looking at things differently to try and understand people's emotional responses. And so, I think it's going to be trial and error. It's going to be sort of sharing stories and hearing what other people are doing. But I think it kind of comes back to what I said at the beginning, is it's not about kind of racing out there to get the best tools out in the market to suddenly, start being able to monitor everyone and how they're behaving and feeling without them even realising it, because, most companies don't have the resources to do that. But I think it's actually just comes back to taking it back to the basics, which is, HR just needs to start thinking differently. And we're not going to have all the answers. We're not going to have all the data to be able to tell us, how to make the best employee experience for our own organisational context, according to kind of what our needs are. When I say our needs, I mean the employees and the organisation.
Yeah.
but I think we need to just start thinking a bit differently, and taking a slightly different approach, and not just thinking about kind of annual and pulse surveys, but actually when are those key moments to actually ask employees how they're feeling, even if it is just a kind of quick survey monkey to get an understanding, really kind of break down that kind of whole employee journey and understand it much better than we do currently, and like you say, use other things like focus groups and other ways of kind of testing that out and finding out how people are experiencing certain aspects of that employee journey, and then kind of taking, at the moment our HR room is full of post-its all over the wall, which is great because it's just kind of hopefully generating ideas, and it means if other people from other departments come into our room, they can help contribute as well their ideas, and we can explain kind of, some of the thinking around it. So I think, it's just around kind of getting people in the organisation to collaborate more. So we're understanding the challenges that all the different departments are kind of facing, co-creating and coming up with new ideas that hopefully, help some of the challenges within our organisation, but actually, asking people as well with those kind of changes that we might make, how they're feeling, at those kind of critical moments, so we can just understand everything better. And so for me, employee experience is about thinking in a different way, not having all the tools to necessarily give us some kind of amazing experience beyond our wildest dreams.
No, exactly. And whichever kind of technology you so let me start that again. We can never read somebody's mind, so we never truly know how somebody's feeling, and even more so, we never truly know why somebody's feeling that way. Even in my role as a behavioural analyst, I can look at somebody's language pattern, I can listen to their voice, I can look at their facial expressions, I can analyse their body, I can look at a big set of data, doing a corpus linguistics type approach, and see how language use differs by population and so on, all of which I do. But all that ever does is give me an indication, or it suggests how people may be feeling. It's never as conclusive as saying, I see X, that means Y. It's never that simple. There's always other aspects to it that you don't know. So whichever approach you go for, whether it be surveys, focus groups, technology, analysing language, whatever approach you do, it's only ever giving you part of the picture. You're never going to get the full picture. I guess my counter to that is, if it gives you more of a picture than you got in the moment, then likely that's a good thing. So the more you can do to understand how people are feeling, what that emotional connection is like, what are those factors or those variables or those occasions or those times when that emotional connection gets stronger or weaker, gather more data around that, and the better informed you will be as an organisation, and likely you can make better decisions off the back of that. But whatever data, whatever method you choose, you can never read somebody's mind. Even sticking with an fMRI scanner isn't going to allow you to read their mind. It'll tell you what part of their brain is firing, but it won't allow you to read their mind.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think, if I think of myself, I don't know why I think the way I do sometimes. So I can't expect someone else to understand that.
Yeah.
What technology they have.
So I mentioned in my introduction that that you were kind of starting on your research, starting out as a researcher. Could you tell me a bit more about that? What's kind of that? Where are you going with that? What are you wanting to do, or where are you going with that?
Yeah, I think you've probably made it sound grander than it actually is. I think it's more a case of I've just wanted to understand some of the academic research behind some of the areas that are of interest to me. And I think with social media out there these days, there's a lot more available to people. I think academics as well make things much more accessible to people as well, so we can understand, I think you inferenced it earlier, organisations don't have the resources to do these huge studies where they're kind of analysing certain aspects to understand exactly what's going on. Whereas if academics are able to get some funding to work on a project that might give us some insight, then, professionals need to be tapping into that to try and understand it and make sure they're making more informed decisions. So I think it's more of a conscious effort that part of what I do is to try and understand and learn as much as I can do, and actually kind of learn new areas. So I think, having your CIPD qualification as an HR practitioner doesn't mean that your learning journey's over. And I'm sure everyone else would agree with that as well. But I think actually exploring other disciplines outside of HR is really important to HR. We're moving into a world where job roles are going to kind of change, and hopefully job crafting is becoming something that organisations will take on more, because certainly as my kind of career journey's gone on, I've wanted to incorporate other elements that are outside of the kind of traditional HR context. And actually the areas that really interest me are kind of technology and user experience and elements of marketing, and trying to understand that, because actually it helps me in my role as an HR practitioner. So I think, through that kind of research journey, who knows where it will take me eventually, but it's certainly opened up a lot more kind of interesting conversations. And actually, a friend of mine that I know down in Brighton, she's a professor of digital transformation design, and so she's been really critical in my learning journey and kind of pointing me in the direction of things to go and look at and research and understand better, which has really helped as well. And I think the more interaction we get between academics and practitioners, the better it will be for everyone.
And who's the professor down at Brighton?
Sorry, so Karen Cham works at the University of Brighton.
Okay, I will put a link to her bio or her profile in the show notes as well, so that if anybody wants to explore what she's up to and see what she's doing, then they can go and find that as well.
Great.
Okay, so is there if I was listening to this podcast and I was thinking, right, I really want to do something around employee experience, and I know I've done a really thing that hosts should never do. I've started to ask a question, and I'm going to do a bit of talking, and then I'm going to ask the question again. I should have just done the talking first and asked the question after, but anyway, so I know as we've gone through, we've kind of given some hints, tips, or starting places, or where people can focus their attention. So if I was a listener to the podcast then, and I was thinking, right, I want to start thinking more about this whole employee experience thing, what would you recommend as my starting steps?
So something that's been, I suppose a couple of aspects, but something that's been really helpful to us is hackathons, and we've had Perry Timms that's come into our workplace and run a few hackathons with us, which has been great. Hackathons are a great way to kind of get lots of people in a room, not necessarily just within HR, but from all different departments. And in our case, we had other people come in from other organisations as well.
Okay.
To actually, run hackathons, which are just really around that kind of design thinking process, and within a kind of short space of a time, actually get to the end of a morning session where you've come to the end of it with almost kind of an idea for a kind of product or a service or a different way of doing something, and it's a really energized environment to kind of work in.
Okay.
And they're quite easy to kind of put together. But I think, as a first step, more than anything, it's probably just mapping out what your journeys look like. And I think, for any HR practitioner, that should be something that's easy to do. It shouldn't be one person sitting in a room mapping that out. It needs to be a kind of energized, co-creative environment where you get a few people in a room, maybe not even from HR, get some employees in there as well, to look at what that journey looks like from beginning to end, and those kind of key touch points. And I think, straight away that automatically starts you thinking slightly different, and then breaking down those kind of key areas to really consider each of the sort of steps, the transactional steps that people go through, but how you can make those more transformative by kind of enhancing that kind of emotional connection, whether it's kind of just making something easier to access, not as difficult, or whether it's just making that a more enjoyable process. And I think you can, through mapping out that employee journey, you can already start to look at areas that you think actually, we know from kind of feedback that we've had that these are potential kind of areas that people face challenges with when they get to that point. And so, sort of focusing on those areas first, you can hopefully start to see some results. But the main aim of it is that if you're coming up with ideas to change something, is, you know, just implement a few changes around it and then measure how people are experiencing the changes that you've made. And, you know, has it worked? It doesn't matter if it hasn't. You know, you go back and you start creating ideas around that again. And if it has worked, then great. But, you know, revisit it later as well, and just continually sort of measure how those kind of redesigning of the sort of experiences and the steps people go through, you know, make people feel.
So my addition to that is going to be the temptation as a HR practitioner is to, or can be, to link that to the key parts of what you expect the employee life cycle to be, like recruitment, performance management, that sort of stuff. When you go about it, if you frame it in that way, then that's the data that you'll get back. So when you go to collect your data, think carefully about the questions that you ask or the methodology that you ask, because the challenge is you could just be checking your own homework, and actually what you learn is how good your HR process, or how good, or what the experience is like of your HR processes. That doesn't necessarily mean that your HR processes are the key important, you know, points in somebody's career progression or career journey. They, just because you think they might be, doesn't mean they actually are. So make sure you keep your data collection approaches broad. You know, don't ask questions about your own processes. Don't just ask questions about those particular times. The more you can do to gather data about what meet the times or the occasions that mean the most to the people, the employees themselves, then that's going to be much more helpful for you to get a well-informed view of customer experience, not just how well do people experience your processes.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think what's important as part of this journey mapping is to not just have HR people in a room.
Yeah.
You have to bring people from around the business into the room, have the actual users themselves contributing to what that journey looks like, and then hopefully that should deviate away from kind of what you suggested, you know, can often happen.
Yeah. So I got on a soapbox for a moment there. I have stepped off my soapbox though.
Good.
Okay, so any recommendations there, Lara, about either videos to watch, websites to read, articles to view? So I've picked up a few as we've worked our way through. So I've picked up the HBR article. I've picked up links to what else have I done? To the Moira Clarke study, to Arctic Shores, to Karen Cham. Any other places that people should go and look for more information if they wanted to go and find more?
Yeah, I mean, I'll send you across a few links so you can.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, when you're doing the podcast. But I think certainly, you know, around design thinking, there's an organisation called IDEO, who do an awful lot of work around that and what that design thinking process is. But I think in this day and age, you know, you've only got to go onto the internet and type a few words in there, and you'll see, you know, there's certainly, whatever you delve into, you will then find other people that then are kind of pulling it apart and putting their ideas in. And I think at the end of the day, you know, that's the whole thing about kind of research and learning, is you find what speaks to you and what you feel will work for your organisation. It's not about, right, this is the definitive answer of how it works. You know, it could be that you need to adapt things for how you do things. But I'll ping some links across around some of the core aspects around kind of user experience design and systems thinking. But yeah, go out and have a look on the internet, because there's an awful lot of stuff on YouTube and sort of blogs and articles around all of this stuff. But I think, you know, my main thing is steer away from kind of employee engagement and that more traditional sense, and kind of go outside of the HR spectrum and see what's out there.
Wonderful, thank you, Lara. So my final question then, is there anything else that you're thinking, feeling, or want to say?
I don't think so, other than thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and it's Friday and the sun's shining, so it's all good.
It's all good. It's all good. Thank you very much then. So thank you so much, Lara. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast. For our listeners, if you want to find Lara, if you want to keep the conversation going, then on Twitter you can find her at...
It's at _Lara_HR.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So we'll wrap it up then. So thanks very much. Yeah, thanks very much, Lara. Appreciate you coming on the podcast. So thank you for your time.
You've been listening to the Emotion at Work podcast. Written, recorded and presented by Phil Wilcox. Edited together by Simon Leverton. You can find more information at emotionatwork.co.uk or follow us on Twitter at @PhilWilcox. Thanks for listening.